If you want to understand the sheer, unadulterated scale of the nightmare that awaited the American military in the fall of 1945, you only need to look at a small purple ribbon holding a heart-shaped medal. In preparation for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the United States War Department ordered the manufacturing of 500,000 Purple Heart medals. They looked at the intelligence, they looked at the terrain, and they calculated that they would need 500,000 medals for the dead and wounded just to secure a foothold. We are still issuing those exact same medals today to veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, because the stockpile created for the invasion of Japan was so massive that we have not yet run out. That is not just a logistical anomaly. That is a chilling testament to a bloodbath that was planned, calculated, and fully expected by the top brass. Welcome back to the channel, where we strip away the myths and dig into the cold, hard tactical realities of military history. If you want to understand the wars of the past and how they shape the doctrines of today, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and let me know in the comments. Do you think the invasion of Japan would have surpassed the Eastern Front in sheer brutality? Now, let us dive into the classified files of Operation Downfall, the largest, most complex, and undeniably most suicidal amphibious assault ever drawn up on a chalkboard. To grasp the strategic context of Operation Downfall, we have to rewind and look at the geopolitical board not just in 1945, but decades prior. The Japanese military doctrine of the 20th century did not just appear out of thin air. It was forged in the fires of the Meiji Restoration and validated during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. At the Siege of Port Arthur, the Imperial Japanese Army learned a terrifying lesson that they carried right into World War II. That overwhelming firepower could be defeated by an absolute, fanatical willingness to absorb massive casualties. They threw waves of infantry against Russian Maxim guns, and eventually they won. That victory hardwired a dangerous concept into the Japanese high command. They believed that spiritual superiority and the willingness to die would always triumph over Western industrial might. Fast forward to the summer of 1945. The United States had spent 3 years executing a grueling island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. We bled for Guadalcanal. We turned the coral reefs of Tarawa red. We flattened the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, and we endured the kamikaze hell of Okinawa. But taking isolated islands is one thing. Invading a sovereign, industrialized island nation that has never been conquered in its recorded history is an entirely different tactical problem. By July of 1945, the strategic bombing campaign, led by General Curtis LeMay, had reduced over 60 Japanese cities to smoldering ash. B-29 superfortresses were dropping thousands of tons of M69 incendiary bombs, creating firestorms that reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, literally boiling the water in the canals of Tokyo. The United States Navy had executed a masterclass in submarine warfare, establishing a total naval blockade that choked off Japan's oil, rubber, and food supplies from Manchuria and the East Indies. Logically, by Western military standards, the war was over. The Japanese had no functional blue water navy left. Their air force was relegated to suicide missions. Their civilian population was subsisting on less than 1,200 calories a day. But did they surrender? Of course not. Why would a military junta that viewed surrender as a mortal sin against their god-emperor throw in the towel just because they were starving? They were preparing for the final, glorious, apocalyptic defense of the homeland. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, realized that starving Japan into submission might take years, and the American public was growing weary of the butcher's bill. The decision was made. If Japan would not yield, the United States would have to drive a stake directly into the heart of the home islands. The plan was designated Operation Downfall, and it was divided into two massive sledgehammer blows. The first phase, Operation Olympic, was scheduled for November 1st, 1945. Its objective was the southern island of Kyushu. The second phase, Operation Coronet, was slated for March 1st, 1946, targeting the Kanto Plain on the main island of Honshu, driving straight into Tokyo. Let us break down the correlation of forces, starting with the American side, because the logistical undertaking here makes the D-Day landings at Normandy look like a weekend training exercise. For Operation Overlord in Europe, the Allies crossed the English Channel, a body of water roughly 20 miles wide, to land on the beaches of France. For Operation Olympic, the United States Navy had to transport assault forces across thousands of miles of hostile ocean. The staging areas were Okinawa, the Marianas, and the Philippines. We are talking about supply lines stretching over 5,000 miles back to the naval yards in San Diego and San Francisco. The Pacific Theater is defined by the tyranny of distance. Every single M1 Garand rifle, every gallon of high-octane aviation fuel, every single sea ration had to be loaded onto Liberty ships, sailed across the largest ocean on Earth, and unloaded under the constant threat of enemy submarines and aircraft. To execute Operation Olympic, General Douglas MacArthur was given command of the United States Sixth Army, led by General Walter Kruger. Kruger was a pragmatic, hardened commander who had orchestrated the brutal campaigns in New Guinea and the Philippines. For the initial assault on Kyushu, the Sixth Army was assigned 14 divisions. To put that in perspective, the initial assault on Normandy utilized just 5 divisions. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of combat troops hitting the beaches simultaneously. The V Amphibious Corps, consisting of the 2nd, 3rd, and 5th Marine Divisions, would hit the western beaches. The 1st Cavalry Division and the 43rd Infantry Division would strike the east. This invasion force was backed by an armada of over 42 aircraft carriers, 24 battleships, and 400 destroyers and escort vessels. The naval gunfire support plan was designed to completely obliterate the coastline. Battleships like the USS Iowa and the USS Missouri were prepared to hurl 2,700-pound armor-piercing shells from their 16-inch guns to shatter Japanese concrete bunkers. But firepower has its limits, and this brings us to the geography of Kyushu. If you were a defense planner, Kyushu is exactly what you would want an island fortress to look like. It is roughly the size of Indiana, but it is covered in rugged, heavily forested mountains that run right down to the sea. There are very few suitable landing beaches, and those beaches are backed by high ridges and deep ravines. The soil in southern Kyushu is largely volcanic ash. It is terrible for the tracks of a 66,000-pound M4 Sherman tank, which would bog down instantly. But it is absolutely perfect for digging caves, tunnels, and subterranean fortresses. The United States was bringing a mechanized, highly mobile, combined arms military to a battlefield that completely negated mobility. How do you maneuver an armored column when the only roads are narrow dirt tracks, winding through flooded rice paddies, flanked by terraced hillsides bristling with hidden anti-tank guns? You do not. You dismount your infantry, and you fight for every single yard with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and bayonets. We saw this at the Battle of Tarawa, where the Marines learned the hard way that naval bombardment does not destroy deeply dug-in bunkers. We saw this during the American Civil War at the Battle of Cold Harbor, where Union troops charged into prepared, overlapping fields of fire and suffered catastrophic losses in minutes. The planners for Olympic knew that the beaches of Kyushu would be a mechanized meat grinder. Now, let us look across the battle lines at the Japanese defense plan, codenamed Operation Ketsugo, which translates to Operation Decisive. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters were not fools. They lacked material resources, but they did not lack tactical intelligence. They looked at the map. They knew that American land-based fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, had a limited combat radius. For the US to provide air cover for an invasion of Tokyo in 1946, they absolutely needed the airfields on the southern island of Kyushu in 1945. There was no element of surprise here. During Operation Fortitude in Europe, the Allies successfully tricked the Germans into thinking the invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. In the Pacific, there was no tricking the Japanese. They knew exactly where MacArthur was coming. They correctly predicted the exact landing beaches on Kyushu: Miyazaki in the east, Ariake in the south, and Satsuma in the west. Because they knew exactly where the blow would land, they reinforced Kyushu with a speed and efficiency that shocked American intelligence. In early 1945, the Japanese had perhaps 3 combat divisions on Kyushu. By August, through a massive redeployment of troops from Manchuria and the mobilization of every able-bodied man, they had built up an army of 14 divisions and 3 tank brigades. We are talking about 900,000 Japanese soldiers dug into the hillsides of Kyushu, waiting for the Americans. American signals intelligence, known as MAGIC, was intercepting the Japanese communications. The intelligence officers in Washington watched in absolute horror as the estimated number of Japanese defenders on Kyushu doubled, then tripled, then quadrupled over a few months. The invasion ratio, which standard military doctrine dictates, should be at least 3 attackers to 1 defender, was rapidly approaching a 1-to-1 ratio. Attacking a heavily fortified mountainous island with a 1-to-1 troop ratio is not a military strategy. It is a mass casualty event. But the regular infantry was only one part of Operation Ketsugo. The Japanese had realized that they could not win a conventional gunfight against the United States. Their industrial base was shattered. They could not produce enough Type 99 Arisaka rifles to arm their men, let alone manufactured tanks or artillery to match out the Americans. So they shifted their entire military doctrine to asymmetric suital attrition. The crown jewel of this strategy was the Tokotai, the special attack units, better known to the West as the Kamikaze. The Japanese husbanded a secret reserve of over 10,000 aircraft. These were not just Mitsubishi Zero fighters. They were obsolete biplanes, wooden trainers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Anything that had an engine and could carry a 500-pound bomb was hidden in camouflaged caves and under thick forest canopies, completely immune to American bombing raids. Their tactical doctrine for using these aircraft was ruthlessly pragmatic. During the Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze pilots often targeted the radar picket destroyers, the first ships they saw. For Operation Ketsugo, the orders were changed. The kamikazes were ordered to ignore the heavily armored battleships and the heavily defended aircraft carriers. Their sole objective was to swarm the unarmored troop transports. Imagine the scenario. A single wooden biplane, flying inches above the waves to avoid radar, slips through the defensive screen and crashes into a heavily loaded Liberty ship. In an instant, 1,000 American infantrymen are killed before they even see the beach. The Japanese calculated that if they could sink just 30% of the invasion fleet at sea, the assault would collapse. When your enemy's entire logistical and tactical strategy relies on the fact that their soldiers and pilots do not require a return trip, how do you defend your fleet? The US Navy planned to deploy massive screens of anti-aircraft fire, utilizing the deadly VT proximity fuse, which detonated artillery shells when they sensed an aircraft nearby. But the sheer volume of the planned kamikaze attack, launching in waves of 300 to 400 planes per hour, threatened to simply overwhelm the mechanical firing limits of the American anti-aircraft guns. And the suicide tactics did not end in the air. The Japanese coastline was laced with hidden concrete pens, housing the Shinyo fast wooden motorboats packed with 550 pounds of high explosives in the bow. Thousands of these boats were ready to swarm the landing craft as they approached the shore. Below the waves, the Kaitan manned torpedoes waited. These were essentially standard torpedoes modified with a cockpit, allowing a pilot to steer the explosive directly into the hull of an American ship. Even the shallow waters of the landing beaches were heavily defended by the Fukuryu, the suicide frogmen. These were men equipped with primitive diving gear, armed with 15 pounds of explosives mounted on the end of a bamboo pole. They were trained to walk along the ocean floor, wait for an American landing craft to pass overhead, and thrust the pole upward, destroying the craft and themselves in the process. Beyond the specialized suicide units, there was the mobilization of the civilian population. In June of 1945, the Japanese government passed the National Volunteer Combat Law. This effectively drafted every male between the ages of 15 and 60 and every female between the ages of 17 and 40 into the volunteer fighting corps. We are talking about a civilian militia of 28 million people. They were not issued uniforms, they were not issued modern weapons. They were handed ancient matchlock muskets, single-shot pistols, pitchforks, and sharpened bamboo spears. Their orders were simple. If an American soldier sets foot on Japanese soil, you charge him, you stab him, you detonate a satchel charge under his tank. You do not survive. You just take one American with you. How does a conventional Western military force deal with a battlefield where the concept of a non-combatant no longer exists? If an American Marine squad is advancing through a ruined village and a 12-year-old boy steps out of a doorway holding a grenade, what is the tactical response? The psychological toll this would have taken on the American infantryman is almost impossible to quantify. We saw glimpses of this horror on Saipan, where thousands of Japanese civilians threw themselves off cliffs rather than surrender to the Americans. We saw it on Okinawa, where civilians were caught in the crossfire or forced into suicide by their own troops. But to scale that up to a nation of 70 million people was a scenario that gave veteran American commanders literal nightmares. The stage was set for a clash of absolute, fundamental extremes. On one side, the greatest industrial and amphibious juggernaut the world had ever seen, armed with overwhelming firepower and a mandate to end the war at all costs. On the other side, an entrenched, fanatical defense force, utilizing the rugged terrain of their homeland, prepared to sacrifice their entire civilization to inflict unacceptable casualties. The fleets were gathering in the staging areas. The final aerial reconnaissance photos were being developed in darkrooms aboard aircraft carriers, revealing a coastline bristling with newly dug trenches and artillery emplacements. The men of the Sixth Army were cleaning their weapons, writing letters home, and looking out across the vast expanse of the Pacific, knowing that the beaches of Kyushu were waiting for them. To understand the sheer mechanical violence that would have unfolded on X-Day, November 1st, 1945, you have to look at the tools of destruction both sides brought to the volcanic beaches of Kyushu. The United States military was an unstoppable juggernaut of mechanized warfare, built on a doctrine of overwhelming firepower and rapid mobility. The standard American infantryman was carrying the M1 Garand, a gas-operated, semi-automatic rifle, weighing 9.5 pounds, firing a .30 caliber round from an 8-round M-block clip. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering that gave a single American squad more organic firepower than a full Japanese platoon. But the M1 Garand was designed for the open fields of Europe and the sweeping plains of the American Midwest. In the dense, suffocating bamboo thickets and narrow, twisting ravines of southern Japan, long-range accuracy meant absolutely nothing. The real king of this horrific battlefield would be the M2 flamethrower. This was a brutal, terrifying piece of equipment weighing 72 pounds, fully loaded. It consisted of twin tanks strapped to an infantryman's back, holding 4 gallons of jellied gasoline pressurized by a nitrogen propellant. When the operator squeezed the trigger, it projected a stream of liquid fire over 40 yards, burning at more than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Why was this horrific weapon the centerpiece of the American tactical plan? Because high-explosive artillery shells do not work against a 90-degree bend in a subterranean tunnel. To clear the Japanese cave networks, Marines would have to walk directly up to the firing slits, under heavy machine gun fire, and pump raw fire into the earth, suffocating or incinerating everything inside. But getting close enough to use a flamethrower requires armor support, and this is where the geography of Kyushu becomes a nightmare. The American M4 Sherman tank was a reliable 33-ton beast of burden, armed with a 75mm gun. It was the backbone of the armored thrust. However, the soil of southern Kyushu is largely composed of a volcanic ash known as shirasu. During the dry season, it is a fine, choking dust. But November is the tail end of the typhoon season in the Philippine Sea. When mixed with heavy autumn rains, this volcanic ash turns into a deep, gelatinous sludge. A Sherman tank exerts about 14 pounds of ground pressure per square inch on its narrow tracks. In the shirasu mud, these 66,000-pound machines would sink straight to their axles, turning them into stationary steel pillboxes. How do you protect a mechanized armored column when your tanks cannot move, and every patch of tall grass could hide an enemy soldier? You simply cannot. The Japanese knew the American tanks would bog down, and they designed their anti-tank doctrine around it. They did not rely on heavy armor of their own. Instead, they relied on the Type 99 magnetic mine. This was a canvas pouch containing 8 cast magnets and 3 pounds of TNT. The tactical execution was suicidal but brutally effective. A Japanese infantryman would hide in a spider hole, completely covered by brush, wait for an American tank to churn past in the mud, sprint out, slap the magnetic mine against the side of the Sherman's hull, and pull the friction fuse. 10 seconds later, the shaped charge would blow a hole straight through the armor, turning the interior of the tank into a burning slaughterhouse. It was a low-tech, low-cost solution that completely neutralized American industrial superiority. The Japanese defensive strategy on Kyushu was a masterclass in terrain exploitation, centered around the concept of the reverse slope defense. During the early days of the Pacific War, the Japanese would build their bunkers right on the beach, facing the ocean, trying to stop the Americans at the water's edge. They learned very quickly that anything sitting on a beach would be atomized by the 16-inch guns of the United States Navy. So they adapted. At the Battle of Peleliu, and later at Iwo Jima, they moved their defenses to the back side of the hills. If you look at American military history, this is eerily similar to the Confederate tactics at the Battle of the Wilderness during the American Civil War, where dense, impenetrable brush negated Union artillery, forcing a blinding, suffocating infantry brawl at point-blank range. On Kyushu, the United States Navy would bombard the front of a coastal ridge for days, shattering trees and churning dirt, hitting absolutely nothing of value. When the American Marines finally fought their way up the steep slope and crested the ridge, they would be silhouetted against the sky. At that exact moment, the Japanese, dug into the reverse slope, would open fire. Their primary weapon for this lutia was the Type 92 heavy machine gun, nicknamed the Woodpecker by American troops due to its distinctive, slow, rhythmic firing sound. It fired a heavy 7.7mm round at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. These guns were mounted inside heavily reinforced concrete pillboxes, positioned to create interlocking fields of crossfire. If an American squad tried to flank one machine gun, they would step directly into the kill zone of another. Behind the machine guns were the Type 92 battalion guns, 70mm light howitzers that could be broken down, carried by hand, and fired from deep inside cave mouths. The Japanese would roll the gun to the entrance, fire a few rounds into the advancing Americans, and immediately pull the gun back into the tunnel before American counter-battery fire could respond. Let us walk through the hypothetical, hour-by-hour nightmare of X-Day, November 1st, 1945. At 0400 hours, in the pitch black of the pre-dawn morning, the largest naval armada in human history drops anchor off the coast of Kyushu. The weather is terrible. A massive typhoon, similar to Typhoon Louise, which historically devastated the American staging areas in Okinawa in October, has left the seas churning with 15-foot swells. The men of the V Amphibious Corps are climbing down cargo nets into their Higgins boats, and LVT-4 water buffaloes, weighed down by 80 pounds of gear, slipping on the wet steel, vomiting from seasickness and sheer terror. At 0500 hours, the pre-landing bombardment begins. Battleships like the USS Texas and the USS Arkansas unleash broadsides of 14-inch and 12-inch shells. The concussion physically shakes the landing craft miles away. The sky over Kyushu turns a violent, unnatural orange as thousands of tons of high explosives slam into the shoreline. But as dawn breaks at 0600 hours, the Japanese counterattack begins, and it does not come from artillery. It comes from the sky. The radar pickets on the outer screen of the fleet report hundreds of incoming contacts. It is the Kamikaze swarm. The American Combat Air Patrol, flying F-4U Corsairs and F-6F Hellcats, dive into the massive formation of obsolete Japanese biplanes and trainers. The sky becomes a chaotic swirl of tracer fire, burning fuel, and mid-air collisions. The American pilots shoot down dozens, but there are simply too many. A wooden Nakajima Ki-43 fighter, flying just 50 feet above the churning waves to avoid radar detection, slips through the defensive screen. It completely ignores the heavily armored battleships. It aims straight for a massive, unarmored troop transport. The Kamikaze slams into the side of the ship. 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel and a 500-pound bomb detonate deep inside the steel hull. In a fraction of a second, an entire battalion of the 1st Cavalry Division is wiped out before they even see the beach. Despite the chaos, the invasion timeline cannot be stopped. At 0830 hours, H-hour, the first waves of landing craft hit the black, volcanic sands of Ariake Bay and Miyazaki. The ramps drop into the surf. The Marines and infantrymen surge forward, expecting a wall of lead. But the beach is dead quiet. The Japanese hold their fire. This is the ultimate terrifying discipline of the Imperial Japanese Army. They wait as wave after wave of American troops land. They wait until the beaches are completely jammed with men, jeeps, half-tracks, and artillery pieces that are rapidly bogging down in the wet Shirasu sand. By 1000 hours, the trap is sprung. The mountainsides literally open up. Camouflaged steel doors slide back, revealing the muzzles of hundreds of artillery pieces. Mortars, mountain guns, and Nambu machine guns unleash a devastating pre-registered crossfire. The beach turns into an absolute slaughterhouse. Omaha Beach on D-Day was a nightmare, but the German defenders at Normandy were largely static, looking toward the water, and severely lacked artillery ammunition. The Japanese at Kyushu are dug into a 360-degree interlocking network of subterranean fortresses, armed with millions of rounds of ammunition, hoarded specifically for this exact moment. American medics are overwhelmed within minutes. The Higgins boats, trying to evacuate the wounded, are targeted by Japanese suicide motorboats, the Shinyo, which dart out of hidden coastal caves and ram the landing craft, blowing both vessels to splinters. By 1300 hours, the sheer weight of American numbers and desperate, point-blank heroics push the front line off the beach and into the first line of coastal hills. It is here that the American infantry encounters the most psychologically devastating element of Operation Downfall. As a Marine squad advances through the ruins of a coastal fishing village, they are not engaged by uniformed soldiers. They are charged by the civilian militia. Women in traditional clothing, armed with sharpened bamboo spears, rush the machine gun nests. Teenagers with explosives strapped to their chests dive under the treads of the few Sherman tanks that manage to get off the beach. Old men fire ancient matchlock muskets from the rooftops. What happens to the morale of a highly trained, conventional military force when they are forced to gun down grandmothers and children to secure a single street? The psychological trauma inflicted on the American soldier would have been catastrophic, echoing the horrors of the Indian Wars on the American frontier, but on a mechanized, industrial scale. As twilight falls at 1700 hours, the American advance is measured not in miles, but in bloody, agonizing yards. The troop commanders order their men to halt and dig in for the night. They form tight perimeters, set up their water-cooled Browning machine guns, and string trip flares. But the Japanese own the night. The days of the massive, screaming Banzai charge are over. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had forbidden them at Iwo Jima, and that doctrine carried over to Kyushu. Instead, the Americans face infiltration tactics. In the pitch black, under the pouring rain, Japanese soldiers strip down to loincloths, coat themselves in black mud, and crawl silently through the American lines. They use razor-sharp combat knives and satchel charges. American soldiers wake up to find the man in the foxhole next to them with his throat cut. The paranoia is absolute. No one sleeps. Every shadow is a target. and the friendly fire casualties skyrocket as terrified young Americans shoot at anything that moves in the dark. By the morning of X Day +1, the beachhead is barely secured. The casualty reports are already climbing into the tens of thousands, and the logistical supply chain is dangerously close to collapsing under the constant kamikaze attacks on the fleet. The American commanders, looking at the tactical maps in their command tents, realize a chilling truth. Conventional combined arms warfare has completely failed against a nation willing to commit collective suicide, leaving the top brass in Washington to look toward a highly classified, apocalyptic alternative that would change the course of human history forever. That apocalyptic alternative was the tactical deployment of nuclear weapons, a concept that completely shatters our modern understanding of how the atomic bomb was meant to be used. When we think of the Manhattan Project today, we think of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of strategic, city-busting weapons designed to shock a government into political surrender. But in the late summer of 1945, as the intelligence estimates for the invasion of Kyushu grew increasingly grim, General George Marshall and the War Department began looking at the atomic bomb not just as a psychological terror weapon, but as a tactical piece of battlefield artillery. The planners in Washington calculated that the Japanese troop concentrations on the southern beaches of Kyushu were so dense, and their subterranean tunnel networks so impervious to conventional naval gunfire, that only a nuclear blast could crack the defensive line. Marshall literally proposed holding back the production of the next 7 to 9 atomic bombs, waiting until late October, and dropping them directly onto the Japanese beach defenses just 48 hours before the American Marines waded ashore. Think about the sheer, terrifying ignorance of that plan for a moment. In 1945, the American Military High Command had absolutely no functional understanding of deadly residual radiation. They understood the thermal flash. They understood the overpressure blast wave. But they viewed the atomic bomb simply as a very large conventional explosive. If Operation Olympic had proceeded with this nuclear tactical plan, American Marines and infantrymen would have been ordered to disembark from their Higgins boats and march directly through the freshly irradiated, glass-lined craters of Kyushu. The immediate blast would have vaporized the Japanese frontline defenders. But the radioactive fallout would have condemned hundreds of thousands of American troops to an agonizing death from acute radiation sickness in the weeks and months to follow. We would have destroyed our own invasion force simply by walking them through the door we just blew open. And if tactical nuclear weapons were not enough to break the Japanese reverse-slope defenses, the United States was fully prepared to unleash an arsenal of chemical warfare that would have made the trenches of World War I look like a mere prelude. The United States Chemical Warfare Service had stockpiled hundreds of thousands of tons of toxic agents, including phosgene, cyanogen chloride, and mustard gas, in the Pacific Theater. The tactical logic was brutally straightforward. If you cannot shoot a Japanese soldier hidden deep inside a twisting multi-level volcanic cave, you pump heavy, heavier than air, poison gas into the ventilation shafts and let it sink to the bottom. The American military had already drawn up the target maps. B-29 superfortresses were slated to drop M47 chemical bombs on Japanese troop concentrations, logistics hubs, and agricultural centers. If we look back at military history, the use of gas at the Battle of Ypres in 1915 caused psychological devastation, but it was largely dependent on shifting winds and static trench lines. On Kyushu, the United States planned to use chemical weapons offensively, combining them with defoliants to strip the mountains of their protective canopy. A dark foreshadowing of the Agent Orange tactics that would be used decades later in the jungles of Vietnam. The use of poison gas would have undoubtedly broken the Japanese tunnel defenses, but it would have also exterminated millions of Japanese civilians caught in the crossfire, turning the home islands into a literal toxic wasteland for generations. But wars are not fought in a vacuum, and the tactical nightmares on the ground were only one piece of a massive, multi-dimensional geopolitical puzzle. To truly understand why Operation Downfall was the ultimate nightmare, we have to look at the intelligence war. The entire foundation of the American invasion plan was built on a catastrophic intelligence failure that was caught just at the last possible second. For months, General Douglas MacArthur and his staff had dismissed the idea that the Japanese could heavily reinforce Kyushu. They believed the American naval blockade, Operation Starvation, had completely severed the transportation routes. But American cryptanalysts working on the magic intercepts, reading the highest levels of encrypted Japanese diplomatic and military radio traffic, watched in horror as the data proved MacArthur wrong. The Japanese were not just moving troops. They were moving entire armies. They were marching them at night to avoid American aerial reconnaissance. What happens when a military commander's ego clashes with hard, undeniable signals intelligence? MacArthur wanted his glorious invasion, and he initially tried to suppress the magic intercepts, arguing that the Japanese were running a massive radio deception campaign. But Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, saw the raw data and realized that sending his aircraft carriers and troop transports into a hornet's nest of 10,000 kamikazes and 1 million entrenched soldiers was borderline treasonous. The intelligence proved that the element of surprise, the most critical principle of amphibious warfare, was completely dead. The Japanese knew the exact date, the exact time, and the exact beaches. Walking into a pre-registered kill zone is not a strategy. It is an execution. Then, you have to look at the sheer mind-bending scale of the logistics required to sustain this bloodbath. The United States was bleeding money. By 1945, the American economy was entirely mobilized for war, but the public was exhausted. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered in May. American mothers and fathers were celebrating the victory, expecting their sons to come home, only to be told that those same combat-weary veterans of the Battle of the Bulge and the Hurtgen Forest were being loaded onto trains, sent to the West Coast, and shipped across the Pacific for an even more brutal meat grinder. The logistical supply chain for medical support alone is staggering to comprehend. The War Department had calculated that they would suffer roughly 100,000 casualties in the first 30 days of Operation Olympic. To handle this, they pre-positioned massive hospital ships, ordered millions of pints of whole blood and dried plasma, and manufactured the 500,000 Purple Hearts we discussed earlier. Compare this to the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, where 50,000 casualties over 3 days completely overwhelmed the medical infrastructure of the entire region, leaving men to bleed to death in barns and fields. Now imagine that same level of carnage, but occurring on a hostile island 5,000 miles away from the nearest major American medical facility, under constant suicide attacks. The logistical chain of evacuating wounded Marines from the beaches of Kyushu back to hospital bases in the Marianas or Hawaii would have collapsed within the first week. Men with survivable gunshot wounds would have died of gangrene and sepsis in the muddy volcanic trenches. And finally, we must analyze the ultimate political pressure cooker that forced the hands of President Harry Truman. The United States was not the only superpower looking at the map of Japan. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union launched Operation August Storm. Over 1.5 million battle-hardened Red Army soldiers, fresh from the destruction of Berlin, poured across the border into Japanese-occupied Manchuria. They brought thousands of T-34 tanks and completely obliterated the Japanese Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Joseph Stalin was not just looking to secure his eastern borders. He was looking at the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. If the United States had launched Operation Downfall, and the invasion of Kyushu had bogged down into a multi-year, bloody stalemate, the Soviet Union would have undoubtedly launched their own amphibious invasion of Hokkaido from the north. The geopolitical implications of this are terrifying. If you look at what happened to Germany and Korea, divided by the Iron Curtain into communist and democratic states, the exact same fate awaited Japan. We would have seen a North Japan and a South Japan divided by a militarized zone, setting the stage for a massive Cold War flashpoint that could have easily triggered World War III in the 1950s. Truman knew that he did not just have to defeat Japan. He had to defeat Japan before the Red Army got there. In the end, Operation Downfall was relegated to the dusty archives of classified military history. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the shock of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, finally broke the deadlock within the Japanese Supreme Council. Emperor Hirohito intervened, and the unimaginable slaughter was avoided. But the blueprints of Downfall remain a chilling reminder of what happens when two absolute, unyielding forces collide. It was a plan born of necessity, driven by industrial might, and facing a fanatical enemy willing to immolate their entire civilization. It forces us to look at the cold, calculating mathematics of war, where the vaporization of two cities was deemed the more humane alternative, to the systemic, yard-by-yard slaughter of millions of soldiers and civilians on the beaches of Kyushu. War is not just about the battles that are fought, but about the terrifying contingencies drawn up in the dark, revealing the absolute extremes of human destruction. Which factor do you believe was the absolute most critical in forcing Japan's surrender and preventing Operation Downfall? A. The deployment of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. B. The Soviet Union's massive invasion of Manchuria. Or C. The crippling effects of the American naval blockade and strategic firebombing. Drop your answer in the comments below, and let us debate the harsh realities of history.